Good morning. Honoring marriage, honoring God. I want to preface this morning's lesson to let you know that this is PG related with some of the words that I'll be using this morning. So if you have young children that you don't want to hear the word sex, then you may want to take them out. But understand this, that sex, marriage, and those types of things were written about and talked about frequently in the New Testament. Why? Because the body needed to hear about purity. We live in a world today where we are bombarded by sex, by sexual images, by words, music, movies. In fact, I would bet that most 9 and 10-year-olds know more about the birds and the bees than they do about the geography and the capitals of the United States. And they learn it at a very young age. Most children are exposed to pornography on the internet no later than the age of 11. Scary. You can't go down the street generally without seeing an image on a billboard. Turn on the TV, watching a commercial for yogurt, sex. Sports Illustrated, what are they known for? Sports, not in the first week or second week in February. I remember, on a side note, this just popped into my head, that Lisa and I were dating, and it was during Desert Shield, building up to Desert Storm, and I was away, and Lisa was getting my mail and shipping it to me, and I had a subscription to Sports Illustrated. Well, when I got the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue, Lisa and Anna had modified it. And these women were dressed like the Amish. I mean, they had taken permanent marker and covered all the parts. And when I got it, I was just like, that is awesome. My biggest problem, there's a couple of problems with the Sports Illustrated, swimsuit issue, is there was no sports in it. And I'm just like, what a waste of a magazine. You remember that? Yeah, it was just popped into my head. I still have that, by the way. I kept that issue. That's the only issue I ever kept. But they're bombarded everywhere. So why wouldn't we talk about it in here? To talk about what it was intended for. And that's inside the marriage. In Hebrews 13, verse 4, it says, marriage is to be held in honor among all. And the marriage bed is to be undefiled or kept pure, which means you keep your marriage and that sexual relation, that intimacy between a husband and a wife only. This last part says, for fornicators and adulterers, God will judge. In the 1st and 2nd century, we're like, wow, we think we've got it bad today. With all of the sex everywhere and all the images and everything like that, and 50 Shades of Grey and all of the talk, and that it's a box office hit and everything like that. And it's just wonderful. In the 1st century, it was worse. Husbands were allowed to have affairs or relations with their female slave, and it was okay, but the woman couldn't. He was even allowed, in a lot of cases, to have sexual relationships with a prostitute, especially if he went to the temple and used one of their prostitutes. But he was not allowed to go to a brothel. That was frowned upon. First and 2nd century writers would often write and make fun of the Christian people and what they believed and stood for. Why? Because they stood for purity. When the New Testament writers wrote, they talked about the original intent of marriage and sexual relations were to take place in the marriage. To honor that marriage and honor that marriage bed. But they were mocked, they were ridiculed. We see in 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 4 through 5, it says, in all this, because before that, it's talking about, hey, all these people you're around, they're drinking, they're sexually immoral, they're lusting, they're doing all of these parties and everything. It says, in all this, they are surprised that you do not run with them in the same excesses of dissipation or wastefulness or debauchery. They're surprised at that. Now look at this last part. It says, and they malign you, they mock you, they make fun of you. The next verse is, but they will give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. Peter, talking to them, letting them know what is going on, letting them know that they are being maligned for their beliefs and what they stand for. Unfortunately, in the world today that we live, in the United States of America, sex sells. That in of itself is a sad statement, because it was something that was supposed to be so intimate and kept between a man and a woman in the boundaries, and only in the boundaries of marriage. We looked at that last part, in chapter 13, verse 4 of Hebrews, and we're not going to go back to that. It says, for fornicators and adulterers God will judge. Not very often do you get your Sports Illustrated or your Wall Street Journal or your TV guide, or if they even still make that, or turn on the TV and hear the word fornicators or fornicate. And when you look at a lot of people like, fornication, what is that? What is a fornicator? What is fornication? We're not going to get into the deep recesses of Greek and go into all of it. You just need to know this, that when it says fornicators or fornication, we'll start with fornication. Fornication in the Greek means sexually immoral. Porneia, pornos, is a fornicator. See that first root, porn, where we get pornography, sexually immoral. Any sexual union that takes place outside of the boundaries of marriage, same sex, bestiality, incest, prostitution, sexually immorality. That's what it means when we say fornication. So when it's a fornicator here, it's talking about somebody who is sexually immoral. And we're like, wow. We could really just change the name of our country. The United States of fornication. Because isn't that really what we tend to stand for? At least that's what the media puts out there. We see that all the time. And it's sad. We live in a day and age where teenagers, look at these statistics. It says 48% of teenagers, and if you look down at the very bottom, it says Barna YRBS, and that's the Youth Risk Behavior Study Survey. It's done by the government. This is stats and everything from the CDC that I've kind of put into these slides. But if you want to really get into the details, look up Youth Risk Behavior Study Survey, and you will find all of these details. But 40% of all teenagers age 17 have had sex at least one time. In Nebraska, 25% of all high school students, 9th through 12th grade, are sexually active. In the country, it's 34%. So Nebraska is doing so much better. 33% of all those who are sexually active high school students have had one or more partners in the last 3 months. 1 in 4 of those have an STD. That says over half, but it should be just under half of all sexually transmitted, infections or diseases occur in that age group of 15 to 24-year-olds, which is 9.1 million. Each day in America, there are about 25,000 15 to 24-year-olds that are dealing with STDs. 615,000 women in that age group are pregnant. 26% of those end in abortion. In 2010, it says 157,000. So 2013, 2014, the numbers are about 25, 26% of that. You're dealing with about 150,000 human lives that are aborted from sex outside of marriage. And our teenagers our Christian teenagers aren't being taught that that is damaging. They think of sex as something that is nothing more than a bodily interaction. Or, hey, it makes me feel good. They don't realize the scars and the damages that it takes and the toll that it takes on them. Sex is a beautiful thing in the boundaries of marriage. It is intimate. It will grow you spiritually, emotionally, and physically with that one flesh person, your spouse. But we live in a day and age to where we don't want to talk about sex. We're like, okay, we're not going to use the S word. In fact, I think it was just up to a couple of years ago that Lexi wouldn't even say the word. And that's the way we are. And I think part of it is she was so inundated all the time at school and everywhere you look that you're just tired of it. And we as parents say, wow, fornication, of course, that's not the word we use. We use premarital sex, is horrible and it's rampant in our country today. But then we will go and watch 50 Shades of Grey or buy the entire trilogy. What message is that sending? Seriously. And we wonder why our kids grow up to become sexually active, get involved with things they shouldn't get involved in, because maybe a young girl who starts having sex at 12 or 13 has just so much baggage that she turns to alcohol and drugs to escape, because we don't create an environment in our homes and in our church to where we talk about that sex is a beautiful thing, but it's only supposed to take place between a man and a woman in the relationship of a marriage. Let's look in Genesis. Genesis 1:27 said, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall what? Become one flesh. The average age that Americans get married today, for men it's 28.2. In Nebraska it's 27.2. For women it's 26.1. In Nebraska it's 25.7. It used to be 25, 24, 23, earlier. But what we are finding now is that young adults are waiting longer to get married, and as a result of that, they're more open to temptation. We call it cohabitation or premarital. Look at this. 48% of women who are going into their first union or their first relationship with a man end up in cohabiting or living with them as opposed to marrying them. 23% of first unions used to be marriage, down from 30% in 2002 and 39% in 1995. People aren't getting married as frequently. Therefore, the divorce statistics seem like they're getting lower. But in reality, people are just cohabitating. Look at this next slide, or the next one after this. It says 19% of women become pregnant and gave birth in the first year. Within 3 years of cohabitating, 40% of women had transitioned to married, 32% remained living together, and 27% had broken up. Now, I want to do a show of hands here. How many of you have heard that cohabitating, living together before marriage, makes you more likely to end up in divorce? Raise your hand if you've heard that and think that's true. Raise them high. And that's what is taught. The reality is that they've taken the statistic and skewed it so that it makes Christians feel better. When reality is if you cohabit with somebody starting at the age of 18, you're 60% likely to end up divorced if you cohabitate and then get married. But if you cohabitate and have a relationship where you're living together and at 23 and you do that, there's only a 30% chance of divorce, which is less than the national average. Now, I'm not telling you that to say, hey, I'm 23, I get to do it. No, it's wrong. It's sinful in the eyes of God. But I'm not going to stand up here and continue to propagate a lie that the Christian right often sells people to say, hey, don't do it. The reason you don't live together before marriage is because God says don't. You want to see if Cohabitation has changed. Look at this. It's increased nearly 900% since 1965. 73% of 73% of Americans approve of a man and a woman living together. That, brothers and sisters, is scary. Because that's not what God planned for a man and a woman. He wanted them to be joined together in marriage and that covenant relationship with each other and with Him. But Americans say, well, you'll hear, well, you don't buy a car unless you test drive it. What you're saying is I want what I want, not what God has ordained and commanded. That's what's wrong with America. It's not that, God is too limited in His idea of marriage. It's because Americans, men, women, and throughout this world want what we want, when we want, regardless of what God says. And God's told us over and over again, that's not what the plan is. And it's damaging and it's hurtful. 1 Corinthians 6, verse 18 says, flee immorality. Flee sexual immorality. Flee fornication. Flee adultery. Flee incest. Flee all of these things. Every other sin that a man commits is outside the body, but the immoral man sins against his own body. Our God has commanded us what we are called to do as far as our relationship with between a man and a woman. There's to be no intimacy or sexual union that takes place before marriage. That's not what I'm saying. This is what God has said. But yet, in our homes, even of Christians, and I've seen it on Facebook, I've seen people that say, hey, you want to go with me and watch 50 Shades of Grey? And we wonder why our children are growing up and leaving the ideal between a man and a woman and becoming sexually active at 12, 13, 14, 15 years of age. Why? Maybe they're learning it because we are basically condoning it in our own homes. This was something that was prevalent then. It wasn't something that nobody knew about. Let's look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 3 through 5, it says, for this is the will of God, your sanctification, your purity, to keep you set apart. That is, that you abstain from sexual immorality. That each of you, now this is worded really weird here, it says that each of you know how to possess his own vessel in sanctification and honor. Let's leave it right there. Go back. That each of you know how to control his own body and keep it set apart and pure. Verse 5 says, not in lustful passions like the Gentiles, for they who do not know God. We're supposed to abstain from that which the world says is okay. Look at Ephesians 5 and 6. No beating around the bush. We know what is right and wrong, but yet we still give in to our desires. Verse 5 says, for this you know with certainty, that no immoral or impure man or impure person or covetous man who is an idolater, any of those people that, why are you an idolater? I'm not no idolater. You're an idolater when you put flesh in front of God, when you put your desires in front of God. Then it says, none of those has an inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. Now let's look at this next part. Let no one deceive you with empty words. Let none of America deceive you with empty words. Don't let Satan, the father of lies, John 5, verse 44, deceive you with the lies that it's okay, everybody's doing it. You need to test drive that car. You need to know if you're compatible. Don't buy into the lie. When we buy into the lie, we're selling our soul. And it says, for because of these things, the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. Bottom line, sex outside of the boundaries of marriage is sinful. Bottom line. At the end of 13, verse 4, it says, for fornicators and adulterers. Well, it's not really adultery. I'm just doing some light flirting at work, you know. We talked, and she gets me. She understands me. Man, my wife doesn't get me like that. And I can talk to her about anything, and she thinks I'm amazing and interesting. Heard those words? Oh, I don't get enough sex at home with my wife, and so I need to figure out a way. I have needs. I'm a man. 42% of all Americans think that adultery is often justified. 1 out of every 2. And we're going to put some stats up here in a minute that just blow my mind. Let's look at Proverbs. In Proverbs chapter 6, the parent's talking to the son, and he's telling him, hey, you need to be careful out there. These women out there, their lips will drip with honey. They'll tell you certain things, and then you're going to lure it into a place where you will be lost. And in verse 24 of this, it says, hey, be careful of that evil woman or evil neighbor, because she's trying to draw you in. And then in verse 25 says, do not desire her beauty in your heart, nor let her capture you with her eyelids. Oh, she's just got such beautiful eyelashes. They're probably fake. But she's got such beautiful eyes. Contacts. But look at that body. That thing's going to be sagging in 30 years. That's a fact of life. But you and I, who are married, made a covenant relationship with each other and with God Almighty. And we're to honor that. For on account of a harlot, basically says one is reduced to a loaf of bread. Why the Hebrew writes it like that, I don't understand and get all this as an adulterer hunts for a precious life. But maybe if you understand, it says, on an account of your pursuit for a prostitute that costs a loaf of bread. You got to be careful of that. You're willing to give up a loaf of bread for a prostitute. And that adulteress, that neighbor woman next door to you, she hunts for your precious life. God created marriage to be holy, to be honored by a husband and wife. We mentioned and talked about this a little in class today. There's a ruling getting ready to come down in Nebraska tomorrow about whether same-sex marriage is going to be allowed. And there's many people throughout the United States that says this is going to tear the institution of marriage apart. Same-sex marriage is going to turn the institution of marriage apart. First, let me tell you that there is no marriage that occurs between a man and a man and a dolphin, a woman and a pillow. That's not God's marriage. Marriage takes place between a man and a woman, and it doesn't make a difference what the government says is a civil or a legal thing. But we pick at that and don't look at the fact that we lust over our neighbor, or we treat our wife improperly, or we talk bad about our husband. That's okay. We're not destroying the marriage like that. It's just those government who is taking and tearing down the institution of marriage. Brothers and sisters, you want to know what's tearing down a marriage? We are. It starts with you and I being accountable to that covenant that we made with our spouse and our God. I said that when I do a wedding, I said, you know, the words, the vows you speak take but a few short seconds to say, but a lifetime to live up to. And I fear that there are times that we don't live up to them. I can speak to that because Lisa will tell you, gracious, loving wife, for the first 10 years of our marriage, I wasn't the man, the husband that I needed to be to my wife. Who was tearing apart marriage then? Jeff was. And it wasn't until I got my relationship with God right that my marriage started to improve. And you know what? She didn't change. I did. %41 of marriages roughly have one or two of the spouses that have cheated. We're going to just go through some of these. 22% of men have strayed at least once during their married lives. 14% of women. 36% of those who stray is usually with a coworker on a business trip. 17%, this thing just made me want to vomit. Of course, they all make me sick, but this, 17% of men and women admit to infidelity with a brother-in-law or a sister-in-law. And we say Rome and Corinth was evil? These are statistics from last year, 2014, the study ended. Average length of an affair, 2 years. 31% of marriages last after an affair has been admitted to or discovered. Look at this. I'll let you read it. If you were America today, I could take this section, and from Gary forward, if you were all men, and say you would cheat on your wife if you wouldn't get caught. This is what God says. This is what the world does. This is what Jesus says. Matthew 5, verse 27 through 28 says, "You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you," this in that Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is not saying, hey, get past the letter of the law and look to your heart. I think it's 9 times he says, you have heard that it was said, but I say to you. Here he's saying, you've heard that it say, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. What's tearing apart marriage in this country today? Men and women not putting God and his commandments first. God's pretty strict about that stuff, you know. He's telling us that we shouldn't do that. And you know what? I'm looking here and I just feel that I deserve to be happy. When you say I do, and when you said I do to your spouse, you're saying I don't to every other man and woman on the face of this earth. In fact, when you look at another woman, or you flirt with another man, innocently as you claim, what you basically are doing is stealing from your spouse and giving it to someone else. You were saying that what I promised to give you only, I'm going to give to someone else. And worry about politicians and Enron stealing money over and over again. I'm asking you, brothers and sisters, husbands and wives, how much have you been stealing from your spouse and stealing from your God? God created marriage to be wonderful, for us to be one flesh. In Hebrews 13, verse 4, we go back there. It says, marriage is to be held in honor among all. It's mocked and ridiculed often today. And part of that mocking and ridiculing and the divorce rate that's mocked and ridiculed is often pointed at the Christians who claim one thing and then live a different thing. Don't give them the opportunity to mock our Lord by the way you live your life and the choices you make. That marriage bed is to be undefiled, is to be kept pure. We often think, we saw 74% of men, 68% of women say, if I can just get away with it, it'll be okay and nobody will know. God does. Proverbs 5:21 says, for the ways of a man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he watches all his paths. His own iniquities, this man, this sinner, this one who's trying to hide from God, his own iniquities will capture the wicked. He's going to just keep being brought in. This last phrase to me says so much. It says, and he will be held with the cords of his sin. You talk to anybody that's ever been in an adulterous relationship, it's difficult for them sometimes to break free because they don't want to lose what they're receiving on the other side of the fence. Sad. We look, we think, we've got it all figured out, and then we see these statistics that are sobering and sad and contrary to God's word. We started in Hebrews 13, verse 4. Let's finish in the flip of that in Hebrews 4, verse 13. And it says, there is no creature hidden from his sight, but all things are open and laid bare to the eyes of him. This is probably one of the most awkward worded phrases in the New American Standard Bible right here. Laid bare to the eyes of him with whom we have to do. What? With whom we have to give an account. It is all open and laid bare. It carries with it being naked, much like Adam and Eve were in the garden when they tried to hide from God. Are you honoring your marriage? Are you honoring God? It's a simple question. You know, we are called to honor, obey, submit to God first, and to honor and love our spouses. In a world where decadence and sexual immorality is running rampant, where Christians are bragging about the movies that they're going to see, the books that they are reading, what they are basically saying, not me judging, what they are saying themselves is that my pleasure is more important than my God. Well, Jeff, it's just a movie. Well, Jeff, it's just a book. Well, Jeff, it's just a marriage. It's just a little affair. I didn't love him. I didn't love her. You see the idiocy of trying to rationalize sin? My prayer for each of us that are married here today is to honor and be faithful to our spouse. And for those of you who are not married and are single, to honor and be respectful of your spouse that you will one day have. God has created sex for inside the marriage and only inside the marriage. Gospel message, truth message, gospel message. This is the truth. Can God forgive sin? Absolutely. Absolutely. Sinned in your life, erred in your life, hiding something in your life, secret sin, hidden sin, sin that nobody knows about, God knows. And God will forgive. See, that's the gospel part of this message. We sin, we're not perfect, but God's grace is great enough to forgive us when we sincerely give ourselves to Him, submit to Him, submit to His will, and allow Him to forgive us our sins, because that blood was shed 2,000 years ago for the sins that we made today. There's forgiveness in the blood shed on the cross to those who obey the gospel and are buried with Him in baptism. If there's anything we can do, if you need help that you're struggling with something, or you need to share with us that you're doing great and that you have a praise, don't leave here without letting your family know. Please come while we stand and sing.